Okay, that sounds great.
Hello and
Um,
welcome to the 8th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Leah Langby with the IFWS Library System, and today I'm moderating the Library Management track, and assisting me is the very able Ann Hamlin with the Wisconsin Valley Library System. We're glad to have you here this morning, and our presenter for this session is Kelsey Johnson-Kaiser with the St. Paul Public Library, and she'll be discussing programming with purpose and intention. Kelsey, whenever you're ready, please begin.
okay, thanks, Leah. Thanks, Anne. I am happy to be here today. Thanks to all of you who are here participating. Hopefully, this feels useful to you. I am excited to be sharing with you today. So, let's make sure my slides are moving. Okay. So just a little bit of brief introduction about me. Like Leah said, my name is Kelsey Johnson-Kaiser. I'm the Youth Services Manager for St. Paul Public Libraries in St. Paul, Minnesota. I have experience working in small, medium, and large libraries, and also experience doing all of the work, some of the work with the team, and then leading others in doing the work. So hands in a lot of those different places. I started as the Youth Services Director at the Columbus Public Library in Columbus, Wisconsin, which is a small town outside of Madison, a service area of about 9,000. And there I worked to serve youth all ages from 0 to 18, did things around programming and partnerships, collections, kind of, as I'm guessing some of you might experience, you name it, I was working on it. From Columbus, I was a youth services librarian at the La Crosse Public Library in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I was part of a team of youth services librarians there. And I really focused more specifically on school-age programming and services, and also supported early learning through story time, some programming, that kind of thing. And then from there, I came to St. Paul Public Libraries, where I am now. And my job has kind of two halves to it. One, I lead the Youth Services Department at the Central Library. There's a total of 5 of us, including me, here in the YS department. And then I also oversee early learning work across our library system, and do a lot of work around staff training and development, thinking about initiatives and kind of bigger picture direction of some of the work we do. St. Paul is a city library system, so all of our libraries are in the city of St. Paul, and we have 13 physical locations and also a very well-loved bookmobile. So I've done lots of program planning individually and as part of a team, like I mentioned, and in the last few years, I've really been focusing a lot of learning and effort around thinking about how to effectively look at programs as a whole, and thinking about how do we move toward truly meeting our goals as a library, and also do we know what those goals are? So before we jump in, just a quick note that a decent amount of this content was co-created with a colleague of mine, Amy Kuster. She's the Program Experiences Manager at the Skokie Public Library. So I want to make sure to give her credit for all of the great thinking and work that she does. All right, so just an overview of the things that we're going to be talking about today. We are going to define strong services and programs and what that looks like for the purposes of this presentation. Certainly at your library, you may have some more specific or some different things that you look at when you're doing that defining. So just for the purposes of what I'm talking about today, we'll make sure we're all on the same page there. We want to recognize where you are now, and that wherever that is, that's okay. Everybody has to start somewhere. So hopefully what we talk about today, you'll feel like wherever you're at, you can start to plug in some of these ideas and make progress in a way that feels useful to you. We're going to talk about strategies for organizing in larger ways, and also kind of do a deep dive into a useful tool to create some consensus and clarity when working day to day on programs and initiatives. And then we are also going to talk about how to start and how to move forward, even if not everyone is particularly excited. So how do we manage that change, and a little bit about a growth mindset. I'll say right off the bat, change management could be like a whole series of webinars. So not a super deep dive into that, but enough to kind of get you started in thinking about some of those things, hopefully. Just another quick note. As you have questions, please do type them into the chat box. I'm going to take questions at the end to make sure that I don't end up going off on a tangent and then skipping half of the content of the webinar. But definitely, as you think of them, please type them in throughout the presentation. And then Leah has kindly agreed to stop me if there's anything that it does feel particularly confusing, so that I don't go too far when everyone is wondering what is going on. So let's move on. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a sore throat. So we're going to start by doing that definition of strong services and programming, again, for the purposes of what we're talking about today. So when we talk about strong programs and services, here are the things that I'm really thinking about. So one is reaching diverse audiences in your community. So we know that not everything we have or we do is going to appeal to everyone. So what are you doing to encourage broad, diverse participation and inclusion? What are you doing to make sure that people can find things that are interesting or of use to them and kind of plug in regardless of where they're at? So that's something that's really important to consider. Next thing is that your strong services and programming should be moving you towards your goals, whatever they are. So these might be really high-level goals, like why do you have a summer reading program? They might also be smaller scale goals, like you specifically want to partner with one new community organization for a program over the summer. So again, really different scales, but regardless of what that scale is, if it's not supporting the overall library goals, then it's probably time to do some thinking about what that looks like. Kind of along those lines also, support your library's mission. Your programs and services should really be driving the mission. And if they're not, it might be time to rethink or tweak some of those ideas. A few key takeaways and things to consider when we talk about services and programming, and some of the things that I think are really foundational to what we're going to continue talking about today, is that continuing to do more and more and more does not mean that we're doing things better. Creating something new isn't always the answer. And I think we've all experienced this. It can burn us out. It can stretch us too thin. It can reduce focus on what we're really trying to achieve. And it also sometimes can make our patrons feel like they have whiplash, like what should they be focusing on? What do they care about? What do we want to promote to them and make sure they know? It's also okay to stop and ask whether something is even worth doing. I'm guessing, again, a lot of us have asked questions about why something is being done or why it's done the way it is, and we've just always done it that way. And that's not necessarily a reason to continue. So it's totally important and okay to ask whether it's really helping you achieve your goals, and give yourself some time and space to consider whether that something is worth doing. And if it is, that's great. But if it's not, again, might be time to start thinking about it differently. Last takeaway for us to really think about when we continue to consider strong programming, strong services, is that fun in itself is not a goal. So our programs are generally inherently fun, useful, interesting. If they're not, that's certainly something to consider, whether that is something that should be part of the program, but fun can't be the main reason for a program. So we need to make sure there's some sort of underlying goal or direction. And if you can't think of one, maybe it's time to make a change. Maybe it's just time to keep thinking and do some deeper reflection. Programs that have real purpose that you can articulate are a lot more intentional, they're more powerful, and they're also more likely to be supported all around by library administration, by fellow staff members, by your community members. So now that we've defined strong programming, we are going to think a little bit about where you are at. And so this is a time for you to really consider, as we talk about all the different places that you might be coming from, just take a few moments to think about what that looks like for you in your role in your library. So there's no definitive place to start when it comes to streamlining programs. There are just some examples up here. You might be the one person at your library that's doing a ton of stuff. You might be part of a team. You might be a leader within your organization, and I say that knowing that leaders can have positional authority, but also might not be in charge of anybody and have real leadership within a department or within an organization. So whether you have the positional authority or not, if you're a leader, maybe you're not in charge of programs. Maybe you are. Maybe you're already doing some sort of outcome measurements or program evaluation. You might be incorporating some kind of large institutional initiative. Summer reading program is, I think, one that I'm guessing all, if not most of our libraries are doing. Or you might generally just feel confused. And if that's the case, that's okay. Hopefully today will give you some good ideas for places that you can get started. So you might be ready or thinking about some kind of really big undertaking, or you might need to just break off a little piece and start with a smaller change. And either one of those is okay. Being aware of the scope or scale of the work that you're ready to tackle is a really critical part of this process. And I just want to reiterate, it is okay to start small. I tend to personally be someone who is like, let's do this big thing, let's make it complicated and innovative and creative and have all this stuff going along with it. And in the last couple of years, I have really worked to retrain myself to recognize that a combination of much smaller, more manageable changes actually make a much bigger impact over time than attempting one huge change. So regardless of where you're at, know that that is okay. And sometimes just starting with where you're at is what you need to be doing. So here are a couple of questions to get you thinking about where you're at in your library. So how planning and coordination or decision making currently operates in your library. And it's okay if you don't have immediate answers to these. These are good things to reflect on if you're not sure what that looks like. So who is involved in the planning of programs or initiatives? Who makes the decisions? Who does the coordination? Do you have intentional goals around those programs? If I asked you right now, could you tell me what those goals are? How are you measuring success? What does success look like for you? And what kind of data are you incorporating or using to help you identify whether you're being successful? So thinking about kind of all of these things, just take a couple minutes, and I'm going to keep talking because it would be weird if we just had silence for a few minutes, but just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Like, where are you at? What does that look like for your library space? So streamlining isn't about applying a one-size-fits-all framework and then having sort of a poof, now you have a goals-oriented, sustainable program calendar. It's really about being reflective of your current practice, which is why that's where we're starting right now, and then seeing the elements of your current practice that you could dive into more deeply in order to strengthen your whole approach. So it's really not about changing how you do everything. It's a lot more about taking what you have and where you're at and working to intentionally align those pieces with your goals or your resources. So as we move forward, I'm going to be sharing some specific examples from my work in St. Paul. And obviously, I encourage you to think about those in the context of where you're at in your library. All right. So we are going to start big picture and talk about this idea of organizing all of the things that you do. So we are all involved in and juggling a lot of pieces of work, and creating systems to organize all of that data and information, whether it's a way that we think about them or whether it's actual tools and resources, can be really helpful in prioritizing our work, identifying any holes that we either know about or didn't know about, and then actually making an effort to invest in the work that we care about. So what we're going to talk about is how you might start getting a handle on all the things that you or your library is doing. And like I said, this is a higher level look at programs and purpose. But like I mentioned before, these ideas can also apply to you wherever you're at. So if it's something that isn't totally high level, that's still okay. This is still ideas and processes that you can use to think about the work that you're doing or to make progress in the way that you want to make progress. All right. So when we're confronted with a lack of strategy or general confusion or frustration, it can be hard to know where to start. So we're going to spend some time talking about a process that you could use to get the ball rolling and keep the ball rolling, which in my experience is often not something we talk about, but it's a really critical part of our work. So my goal is to provide a framework that you can apply to work that's really big, like a holistic look at what your department or your library is doing, but it could also be something that's at a little bit of a smaller scale. Maybe you're trying to get a handle on a monthly program calendar. So I'm going to share some steps and examples for what that looks like here at FPPL. And again, this is the process that we used, but no, it might look different for you. It might need some tweaks. There might be some steps that are added or shifted around. Quick note before we dive in is that the process that we're going to talk about in the example I'm going to use involves a lot of brainstorming and iterating. And when I say that, I mean like this was refined over the course of a couple of years. And I don't say that to discourage you, but to say progress comes in pieces and that sometimes it doesn't feel like a lot is happening, but that doesn't mean that progress isn't being made. So hold on to that as you think about your work, as you embark on your work, and as you have those times where you feel like things aren't getting done as fast as you want them to. So in terms of setting some groundwork, here's where FPPL was a couple of years ago. And I'm speaking more specifically from a youth services perspective because that's the role that I'm in. But I think it's fair to say that regardless of your role, I'm guessing you can identify with what we were experiencing and sometimes what we continue to experience. So we had so many programs and so many initiatives and so many different pieces of work that were happening amongst a lot of people and a lot of locations that it felt like we were constantly scattered everywhere and we were always reacting to whatever was in front of us. So what we started with is identify the problem. So what is the pain point that you're thinking about? Figuring out that core issue is really the best way to start thinking about how to make change. So before anything else, really have to dive into where is the crux of this issue that's causing the most problem, the most pain, and that's where we can start. So here at FPPL, we honed in on the fact that lots of people were doing lots of different things, and we didn't have any unity in our work. And again, I'm guessing you know the feeling. A lot of scattered stuff. Programs were often based on individual staff interests. New stuff felt like it was always popping up, and yet it didn't seem like the holes that we were trying to fill or the gaps that already existed were getting any smaller. It just felt like we were constantly doing more and more and more work. So the question was, how could we even keep track of what was going on? And more importantly, how would we be able to start to step away from always creating something new and instead focus on how to refine and improve the work that we're already doing? Which brings us to step 2, is start brainstorming ideas for how to make your current situation better. How do you take that pain point and start to improve on it? And you're not necessarily trying to solve a problem because change takes time. And for me, I think a solution implies that everything will be fixed. And that's not necessarily the case. You just want to think about how can I start making change to make some improvements. So at FPPL, we decided what we need to do is create a stronger sense of identity around serving youth in libraries. So how are we already serving youth in libraries? Let's start there. Let's just put it all out, do a giant brainstorm of the ways we serve youth, especially focusing on programs and initiatives. And what that allowed us to do was just see everything in one place, which already helped things feel less scattered. So the next step was to continue this brainstorming process. So we started making change just by putting it all out there and being able to really visualize, okay, here's all the stuff that's happening. And our next step was what's something concrete we can do to keep making progress around this. So for that, it looked like us identifying, okay, we now need a way to categorize in some big picture way. And so we started by saying, what do we always keep in mind when we serve youth as a library? And really specifically, as a library, not as a school, not as a rec center, not as a park, but as a library institution. One of the ways that we, as we thought about this, one of the things that was really helpful for us in thinking about what is our identity serving youth as a library is considering the data that we collect and really getting at what are the goals we have for kids using the library. That was a big clarifying factor. So I think the biggest example that I have is often I think it's easy as a library to feel sort of similar to the work that schools do in terms of educational achievement, opportunities, kindergarten readiness, things like that. However, as a library, we don't really collect information on academic success. That might look different for your library, but here at SPPL, we don't collect that information on academic success. So when we think about our goals for kids, they shouldn't be focused on academic success because we don't have a way to measure that. We certainly might contribute to academic success, I hope we do, but that's not specifically what we're aiming for. When we look at our data collection in St. Paul, it really often focuses on the experiences that people are having and what they're getting out of using the library. So we knew that our goals needed to focus on experiences. So we did those first 3 steps, and now I'm going to talk through the last 3 steps, the prototype, keep it going, and iterate again. And I'm going to switch to a different slide to start to give you a visual of how that looked for us as we transitioned into these next 3 steps. All right, so we have the youth services pillars at St. Paul Public Library. So that speaks to the prototype, step 4. Try something, reflect on how it worked, make changes, try again. The key is to keep doing that trying piece. That iteration is a critical part of this. So we had lots of discussions about what possible ways we could categorize the work that we do. And we kind of decided early on we wanted 3 categories. That felt really manageable for us. So we came up with some categories. We tried to sort of slot and fit our programs and services in, realized it didn't really seem quite right, came up with more options for categories, again, tried to slot programs and services in, and after several iterations, we came up with the 3 pillars you see here. So those are provide experiences to support life skills, promote the joy of reading for fun, and engage in interest-based hands-on learning. Getting to these 3 pillars really helped us see work that we were doing that didn't actually quite fit into these goals that we have for youth, and whether we needed to tweak or drop some of our programs. And it really helped us clarify and get some focus for the programs that lacked clarity and focus. So the example that I have is Reading Together, which you can see as the first piece in blue under Promote the Joy of Reading for Fun. So Reading Together is a reading tutoring program that we offer, but we don't test reading skills in this tutoring program. So we were having a hard time clarifying and communicating the purpose of this tutoring program kind of to everybody, to staff, to the volunteer tutors, to participants, to funders. But after identifying the pillars, we had this sort of light bulb moment, and we saw that really what we're trying to do with this reading tutoring program is promote the joy of reading. We want kids to feel empowered, we want them to feel excited about finding books, and we want them to feel the confidence that they can pick out a book at the library and have an enjoyable experience reading it. So as you can see, this pillar and aligning the Reading Together program with this pillar allowed us to make some program changes. It allowed us to better communicate the goal to participants and staff. And it also allowed us to better use the data that we collected to tell the story of Reading Together to all the different stakeholders, and especially for us to funders, because it's a program that is largely grant funded. So the next step, step 5, after we created these pillars, is keep it going. Give your strategies time to settle and continue using them. They are not going to help you if you spend all this time and energy investing into whatever strategy or whatever organization you do, and then you put it in a file or you save it somewhere, and then you immediately go back to the way you were doing things before. You really have to commit to sticking with the changes and the progress you've made. So at FPPL, we've been using these pillars for about 2 years, and especially early on, we really had to remind ourselves consistently, look at the pillars. What does this mean about the pillars? Just familiarizing ourselves with the fact that we have these 3 core ideas that we want to carry through everything that we're doing in serving youth. So they continue to be really helpful, and I'm happy to say that they have made a difference in the way that I think about our programming. And now when I think about our programming and our services, it feels really second nature to me to think about these youth serving pillars. When we think about updating programs or trying something new, we can immediately use them as a foundation. And as we continue to think about how to collect information about our programs and then share it or use it in a meaningful way, we can make sure that we're collecting the right stuff. So keeping it going, sticking with it, is a really important piece of actually creating the meaningful change that you want to see in your library. And that takes us to the last step, which is that you have to keep iterating. Our work isn't static, and so the strategies we're using to support our work shouldn't be static either. So we have to continue reflecting on the strategies we're using and know that they might need adjusting. And if they do, here's this whole process of brainstorming, iterating, prototyping. That cycle starts again. And so here in St. Paul, what that looks like is we are currently just over 1 year into a new strategic direction. And so it's becoming clear that we need to take another look at what we have in the pillars, what's the work that we have been focusing on and we're focusing on now, what has become important enough that we need to add it. And if we are adding it, we have to make sure that we're staying true to these pillars. Conversely, is there anything that's become less of a priority or that we should reconsider how much time and energy and funding we invest into that? So that was a really quick, I hope it felt quick, I don't know, and sort of high-level look at the way that you can really think about organizing and then helping to solve the pain points that you have when you're thinking about your work on a big scale, on a smaller scale. But now we're going to talk more specifically around what it looks like to have strategies and tools for that sort of like day-to-day work. So like a specific project or a specific program. So when we're considering our programs and services, it's really easy to jump right into planning and logistics. And those sort of like on the ground, day to day, very easy to just focus on what needs to be done and start doing it. But what we're going to talk about is taking opportunities to pause and start with centering library values over logistics in order to make smarter choices and avoid spending time and energy on things that don't pan out or that veer too far in one direction, and then you have to kind of slowly and painfully reel it back because you realize, oh, actually, that's too far afield. So I'm going to specifically talk through a tool called a project charter that you can use to make more informed and intentional decisions in that everyday work. We've been using project charters at SPPL for a couple of years now to help gain clarity and identify our goals and opportunities, and then also more effectively communicate our projects with staff and stakeholders. We did not invent project charters. You can find a lot of different versions of them online. So just want to be clear that we do not lay any claim to the invention of this tool. We just find it really helpful. So what I'm going to talk about more specifically is the different components of the charter and why they're useful, and then put that in the context of a little bit of work that we have done around programming and how that helps us. So we use these project charters really often when we're starting a new program or project or initiative, when we're onboarding people to program planning, when we need to ground ourselves in the goals of a current program, when we're considering big program changes. So it's a very useful tool document for a lot of different situations. One thing I want to say at the outset is that it's meant to be a pretty high level look. So as you'll see on the next slide, it's not more than 1 page, and it's not the place for a lot of detail. So as we talk through this, just keep in mind that this is really a way to help organize some of the higher level ideas around a program, but it's not the place for super nitty-gritty stuff. So here is what a project charter looks like. This is a slightly completed project charter. So at the very top, we have the project name, which is Mini Masterpieces. And then at the bottom right, the team selection piece is filled out. But the rest of the charter is sort of template style, and it would still need to be completed for the specific project. So in this case, Mini Masterpieces is a program series focusing on art for young children. So creating a project charter at the outset of this planning process, which involved several different people coming together to take on parts of the work, is a really helpful way to be clear about why we need to do this, how it's going to make things better, and what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to talk through the different components just a bit. So we'll start at the top with the opportunity on the left and the project benefits on the right. So the opportunity is really about why are you doing this? What needs to change? And this is something that can be concrete, but we also want it to be pretty deep. So something like kids in our space are squirrely and they need something to do. That doesn't really speak to the true opportunity of why you're doing this program. It's certainly a reason, but we want to go deeper. So why did you choose to run this specific program or activity? So an example for Mini Masterpieces, which is not on there, I apologize for that, is thinking about promoting the artistic process rather than focusing on a specific product. So we really want to connect kids with the experience of an artistic process rather than focusing on sort of the perfection of this final thing that they create, but really say like the journey is what's important and your creativity and your imagination are the things that we really want to draw out of that. So whatever your why is, make sure you know it and make sure that the people who are working on the project also know it. On the other side of that, we have the project benefits, which is really a way to center this in how is your community going to be impacted because of this project or this program. So what are the good things that are going to come out of it? And this is a really nice way to make sure that as we're thinking about all the different pieces that we need to do, check off our lists, kind of detailed pieces we need to think about, also keeping in mind, ultimately, we're doing this because we care about our communities. And so how is that going to positively impact them? So that's a really nice way to center that piece. Next, we'll move down to goal statements and thinking about what the goals you have that you're trying to achieve. And this is a really important piece for everyone to be on the same page so that everybody is working toward the same thing and can hold each other accountable. If the work that you're doing starts to move in a different direction, it's really helpful to have a document that you're able to reference and center the discussion around this document and the goals that you have written on this document. It's a really good way to depersonalize the work and make sure that it's sort of like this thing that all of us have agreed on. So think about it, like, does your goal focus on numbers? If it does that mean program attendance? If so, how are you going to collect that? How many people do you want to come to your program? Does your goal focus on feedback from patrons? Okay, how are you going to collect that? What kind of feedback are you hoping to hear? How much feedback do you want? Those are all examples of some more specific ways to think about the goals that you're setting, and then how to identify what looks like success for you. Something I really stress, especially when I'm working with staff on a project charter, is that a goal is definitely not a way to say, yes, we were successful, or no, we failed. A goal gives you something to strive for, and then it gives you something to reflect on and something to learn from. Let's talk a little bit about project scope. So what is in the scope of your project and what isn't? I'm sure we've all had experiences where one idea leads to another, and soon you're peeling back layers that show some kind of deep-seated issues that your library has that feel totally insurmountable. And it's like, well, we can never do this program because our staff who are planning it don't understand the fundamental pedagogy for how to engage children with literature. I don't know. That might not be a real thing, but that feels really insurmountable. You're like, well, now we have to close our library for 3 years and retrain everyone. That's not going to happen. So you have to really figure out how far back you're going to peel. when do you say, here's what we're doing, here's what we're not doing? And that's a good thing to be able to differentiate. Keeping everybody clear on the scope prevents projects from getting out of hand. So some examples that we might use in a project like this Mini Masterpieces program series in scope might be providing 2 to 3 programs per participating library location. But out of scope would be, at least for this year, finding additional funding sources beyond what we've currently budgeted to expand the program. So that way, at the outset, everybody knows, here's the budget we have, here's what we're able to deliver, and yeah, it might be really cool if we could expand this bigger. Right now, that's not something we're going to focus on. Not to say it won't happen in the future, but just keeping expectations really realistic and really manageable so everybody is on the same page. If we look to the bottom left, the project plan, thinking about the deadlines you need to be aware of is really important. And we often create deadlines for ourselves at FPPL by working backwards. That's been very, very helpful for us. So if a program is happening on a certain date, when do details need to be finalized for our promotional calendars? Things like that have been very helpful. This, as you can see, is not very big, so it's not a good place for a comprehensive list, but it's great for some important milestones to keep in mind. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about team selection, which is on the lower right-hand side, and I'm going to dive into that a little bit more on the next slide as well. But team selection is a clear place to say who does what. What are the roles of each individual? What is each person responsible for? And that really helps people stay accountable and it keeps the project on track. So I'm going to dive a little bit more into how we've worked to better define roles and the responsibilities around those roles in the next slide. Before I move on, I just want to say I can't overemphasize how important having these shared expectations is. This project charter has been very useful for us to make sure everybody understands what the expectations are. And sharing expectations is also a process. So we talk about them often. We really work to recognize when things are unclear. These project charters aren't meant to be a one and done. As you can see at the top, it says project charter version 1. So sometimes we have to update them, and sometimes we update them many times as a project morphs or grows, or we recognize things need to be a little bit different. So talk about them a lot, recognize when you need to make changes. Also, give yourself a break and know that despite your best efforts, it's not going to be perfect. Some people aren't going to pay attention, and that's okay. Just do your best. Okay, so here's a little bit more around roles and responsibilities, and this really helps us out with the team selection piece. So at any given project, there are maybe a couple people, maybe a lot of people involved. Sometimes it's really clear who's involved, but sometimes it's more nuanced. And I'm guessing all of us have had an experience where we're part of a group and we're wondering what certain people are doing there, or why some people have opinions on something that doesn't really seem to align with the work that they're doing. We're confused on who actually makes final decisions or who's in charge. And that can be a hard place to sit in a group and be wondering those things. So identifying specific roles can help. So what we want to do is start by thinking about the people involved in a given project. And this is a good time to consider not just who's doing the work, but what other colleagues are there, what stakeholders, library leadership, people whose expertise you might want to tap into, etc. So just some examples of roles and responsibilities. They might look different at your library based on your size or who's involved. But this list example that I have here for St. Paul Public Library is something that we've used that's especially helpful to remember people that should be in the loop but might not be super highly involved. So an executive champion, our director is often the executive champion. She doesn't necessarily know the nitty-gritty of what's going on, but this is a really good reminder that, yeah, she cares about what's happening in the library and she needs to be looped into certain projects at specific points. A couple that I want to draw out in particular that we have found extra useful are the team leader and the subject matter expert. So team leader is really helpful in terms of giving some authority to a person who might need to keep a meeting moving along, might be creating agenda, might be have a certain level of decision-making power, that kind of thing. So it can be really helpful to just explicitly identify who that is. And then the subject matter expert is one of those people that probably doesn't need to be heavily involved, but likely has some knowledge that you want to tap into. So often for us, a subject matter expert on our teams is someone who works on our promotional strategies, or maybe the person who's ordering our materials. They might have some opinions or some information to share, but they don't have to be in all of the different plannings or meetings that are happening. So just drawing those out as two that we found very helpful ways to define how somebody is involved without feeling like you either fully have to be part of the project all the time or you can't be part of it at all. All right. So that was a lot to throw at everybody. And as we wind down and get ready for questions, just a few last things that I want to touch on. And the first is change management. And like I said, change management is a huge field. There are people whose careers are dedicated to this. I am not an expert, and I am not doing a deep dive into what change management looks like. I'm going to touch on a couple of things that have been helpful in my experience for moving things forward and making them as successful as possible. So here are a couple of tips. Really encourage you, if you're interested in change management, there's a whole lot of content out there that you can find that can be helpful. But a couple top things. First is go slow. So the examples that I have talked about here happened over the course of years, and they were really iterative. It wasn't something that we rolled out to all of our library staff at once. We started using the project charter with some really specific program planning teams, and then over time, it has expanded out to be used by more people. It's not used by every single person, and not every single person or library staff member in St. Paul necessarily feels comfortable using it. It's still something that we're working on, but we've certainly made a lot of progress in the last couple of years. So remember that your work isn't a one and done process. You're always going to be adjusting, so don't assume that it's just going to happen and then you're going to be able to move on to something different. Take small steps, go little by little, and know that you are ultimately building towards something bigger. And what funnels really nicely into that is that you need to communicate. So communicate early, often, with a lot of people. There's a statistic that says, I think it's the average person needs to hear something 7 times in 7 different ways for it to stick. So make sure that people are in the loop. Help them understand the goals, why you're doing something, and what to expect going forward. You don't have to give a lot of details. The level of detail is really going to be impacted by what that person's role is and how much they need to know. But having some level of communication is always very useful, especially because it can prime people to be ready to hear about what's happening next. It's not going to feel totally new to them. They'll be able to go back into their mind and remember, oh yeah, this person said something about this a couple of months ago, and then again a couple of weeks ago, and we're hearing about it now. So really take the time to communicate often and over a long period of time. The final thing that I want to talk about is really recognizing who makes decisions and when feedback is necessary. So be really clear about the process. An example that I can give is a colleague and I work closely together to plan and lead meetings with our library's children's specialists. And so we might be doing a feedback exercise, but we'll make it really clear, today we're not making decisions. We want to gather feedback on this thing. And our next step is that Marika, my colleague, and I are going to look at this feedback and use it to inform our decisions on what comes next. So we're giving people a voice. We're helping them know how their feedback is going to be used, which is empowering, but we're also setting realistic expectations about what's going to happen and what we can or can't deliver. Final piece that I want to leave you with is this idea of streamlining and working more efficiently and effectively in the growth mindset. So if you are not familiar with that term, Individuals who believe their talents can be developed either through hard work or good strategies or input from others have what we call a growth mindset. Conversely, those who believe their talents are just innate gifts and can't be developed or changed have a fixed mindset. And what we really know through research and experience is that a growth mindset is really important because it helps us understand that change is possible. And so the parting thought that I want to leave with you is that remember that growth mindset, cultivate it in yourself, cultivate it as much as you can in the people that you work with, and recognize that even though sometimes it's painfully slow or it's confusing or it feels messy, that change really is possible and that you can make it happen. You just have to keep at it and recognize that progress is going to happen over time. And that is what I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I will hand over to Leah and Anne to see if we have any questions.
We do have a few questions. So the first one is, there was someone who was really interested in the charter template and wondering if you have any suggestions about like where to get a template or anything like that.
I think that you can find them pretty easily online. If you were to type project charter in like on Google, I'm guessing a lot of different ones would come up. And so that's where I would start. The one that I showed on my slide is like the branded one that we have for SPPL. But I think that you could find them in a lot of places, and you could even use what that one looked like as a jumping off point to create your own if you want.
Okay, great. Another question, how much time I'm sure this varies from program to program, but how much time do you spend planning versus executing programs?
I would say if we're talking about executing as like actually doing the program with patrons versus planning, which is all the stuff that comes before, there's quite a bit more that goes into the planning. And part of that is it depends on, is it a one-off program that's happening at one location, or in the case, like in the example that I gave in the Mini Masterpieces project charter, that is a program series where we have 3 programs for all 13 of our locations over the course of a month and a half. So obviously that planning process is going to take a lot longer. So what I have heard and what I think makes a decent level of sense to adhere to is if you're thinking about just like a single program, you should spend about twice the amount of time planning as you spend actually doing the program. So if you have an hour-long program, 2 hours to plan, obviously that's not a hard and fast rule. But if you have a 1-hour program and you're spending 10 hours planning it, that's probably putting in maybe more effort and more detail than is going to be recognized or is going to actually make a huge impact on the program. That said, again, if you're planning something that's a lot more complicated or a lot bigger, I would say it's probably more time to plan. When we talk about the Mini Masterpieces team, we estimate that the planning process sort of before and then the wrap up after is about 6 to 8 weeks long, and the average is about 3 to 4 hours a week, knowing that some weeks it's going to be more because there's going to be more happening, and then some weeks it's going to be less because pieces are in place and we have the performers coming in and planning the programs, and so the planning team doesn't really have to be doing anything. Hopefully that feels like a useful answer.
Excellent, thank you. Besides a charter, do you use any project management software or communication tools?
Project management software, I personally don't. We don't necessarily have anything as a library system. Well, that's not true. We use an online platform called Basecamp, which is sort of like a I guess it is sort of a program management software, and it's a little confusing because the website is called Basecamp, but also the idea is that all of your projects have a base camp, which is like a place where you can collect documents and you can do sort of like chat style messaging. So we do use that, and that's a nice way to organize, especially because we have staff that are working together across multiple locations. So they might not have physical space that's shared. They might be doing almost all of their work virtually, and they might not even have like shared files depending on where they work. And so that's a web-based, like a cloud-based platform that we use in order to be able to share that kind of stuff. So I would say that is one that we use. In terms of other tools, can you repeat the question, Leah?
Sure. Besides the charter, do you use any project management software or communication tools?
Yeah. And then in terms of communication tools, I don't know that we have anything particularly specialized. I mean, like a lot of organizations, we rely pretty heavily on email. We are, large enough and have enough documents that we have an intranet. I will say it has not been revamped in several years and is notoriously bad, so people don't really like to use it. We have a staff newsletter that goes out once a month, and so sometimes sharing information in the staff newsletter is really useful. I wouldn't say that there's anything we're using in terms of a communication tool that is something that we're investing a lot of money in, or even any money in that I can think of. I think a lot of it is just doing that communication very consistently and being clear and scaffolding. So not necessarily laying every single thing out there at once in one email and then wondering, do people know what I'm talking about? But layering that communication over time.
Okay, excellent. So let's see. Okay. I'm wondering about any advice you have for scaling this to very small library staff.
Yeah. So I'm thinking that I'm assuming scaling means
Just
maybe not working with as many people across so many locations.
right. Like, so if you're in a library that has a total of 3 or 4 staff people, how do you have any thoughts about how that might, how that these tools and these ideas might scale to a smaller situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just a matter of recognizing that like maybe you don't have a bunch of locations or a lot of people that you're taking into consideration. But when we think about like with the youth services pillars that we created, there's a group of 3 of us that worked on that and identified that, and we got feedback from staff who do the work. So in a case of a smaller library, maybe you have fewer people that are giving the feedback. Maybe you are incorporating more feedback from community partners or school partners. If you're relying really heavily on partner relationships as well, you may want to think about what kind of a say they have in it, or kind of where you want to make sure you're getting their perspectives. And then in terms of things like the project charter, I mean, there's times where I fill this out by myself for a project that I'm working on, and then there's times where groups of people fill it out. So if you're working with a much smaller staff, I think it's also just a matter of, is everybody always participating in everything, or do you want to have certain people take responsibility for some areas, take the lead in some spots, or be the decision makers in other spots? Hopefully that helps. If it
That's great.
doesn't, feel free to follow up with more questions.
That's very helpful. Okay, and then we had a question just um, about it. It was more about more specifically about what you're doing at your library related to schools. So do you mind answering a question that's a little off topic, but is kind of related to something that must have piqued someone's interest? I'll just read it to you. What specifically do you
Yeah.
do with the school partnership? Are there programs at the school? How do you get the kids from the school to the library?
Okay. So there's a lot of things that I could talk about. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the major things that we're really investing a lot of time into. So there's a few. So one is we have been really lucky in the last several years to develop a program with St. Paul Public Schools and are currently working on um, working more closely with charter schools and private schools. St. Paul has a lot of charter schools. So right now, St. Paul Public Schools, we have a program that's called Library Go, which is that all St. Paul Public School students get an e-library card that they can use at the public library. And so what we've been doing over the last couple of years, we first introduced it, I think, 2.5 years ago. And so there was a really big push by our staff to help educators understand what these cards are and how they can use them in a really supportive way in the classroom, because all these kids having an e-card number means they can access public library resources from their classrooms. And all students in St. Paul Public Schools have an iPad. And so that was a big resource sharing that we were able to do. And so we continue to do a lot of push around using Library Go, encouraging kids to use it at home. They can check out up to 5 items from the public library, physical items at any one time. There's a whole lot more detail that I'm not going to get into around how we make that work and make that something that's sustainable and not burdensome for kids. So Library Go is a really big one. And then another big one is Summer Spark, our summer reading program. That's what we call it. And so school visits around May to really promote summer reading program and get kids into the libraries and participating in reading over the summer. And then the other big one that we're focusing on a lot right now is we have a One City, One Book program called Read Brave. And that has been going on for 6 or 7 years. And it started really small with a school partnership around encouraging teens in particular to engage with reading books for fun that can be about topics that are of interest to them but can be challenging or hard or painful, and then really trying to spur conversations with adults, and so trying to bridge that gap that sometimes exists between teens and adults. And that program over the years has transitioned to being something that is for all ages. And so right around now and in the few months up to now, our staff have also done a big push of going into classrooms and promoting the Read Brave program. And there's various like fun activities that they do around certain book lists that we have, and getting kids to vote, and we have an art contest. So a lot of different ways that we touch on that with the schools. So hopefully that was a useful overview. I'm happy to answer more questions. I meant to mention this before, and follow up after this if that would be of interest. So obviously my email is there on the screen. So if you want to hear more, feel free to follow up with me.
Great. And then just one last question, which I think will take us out to the end. Can you tell us what your pillars were one more time? What pillars you ended up?
Yeah, and and Leah, I can't remember, is there a place I can or should post my slides?
The slides, yeah. Well, we're taking care of that. You've already shared them with us, and then we'll get them posted on the website.
Yeah,
so that will be available later too.
Perfect. Great. Yep. So I'll for sure go over them here, but then no, you can always refer to them on the slides as well. So provide experiences to support life skills is one of them. The second one is promote the joy of reading for fun. And the third one is engage in interest-based hands-on learning.
Cool. Okay. Those sound like great pillars. Okay. Thank you.
They are working well, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for a great session. And as we already mentioned just a minute ago, this session slides and also recording will be posted on the conference website by tomorrow, hopefully. Our next, actually, our next session in this track is with Vanessa Christman, and it begins at 1 o'clock. I have to read my handwriting here. We hope we see you there. And if not, we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Kelsey.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.